The approach of integration constitutes not simply a rescue mission for Black city children, but a rethinking of public education everywhere. Parents of children in well-regarded school districts may find this unnecessary, but though the harm done to Black students through 200 years of segregation is obvious and easily observed through nearly any metric, white students have by no means gone unscathed. It was this psychic harm that James Baldwin had in mind in the 1964 essay from which this book takes its title. In it, he addressed white parents directly about the insidious effects of racial separation on all children, in particular their own. And he writes, "I know you didn't do it, and I didn't do it either, but I am responsible for it because I am a man and a citizen of this country, and you are responsible for it too for the very same reason. As long as my children face the future they face and come to the ruin that they come to, your children are very greatly in danger too. They are endangered above all by the moral apathy which pretends it isn't happening. This does something terrible to us. Anyone who is trying to be conscious must begin to be conscious of that apathy and must begin to dismiss the vocabulary which we've used so long to cover it up, to lie about the way things are." Rochester, like many places in the United States, has deep familiarity with the moral apathy which pretends it isn't happening. I believe our community can end its dangerous, racist game of make-believe only by dismantling the physical and political barriers of segregation. My hope is that the history contained in this new book will illuminate our community's way in the quest for new ideas, new strength, and a new resolution to stop lying about the way things are.
This is Brockport Writers Forum.
Good morning. We're very pleased to have with us today Derek Walcott.
Our guest today is John Barth.
Our guest today, Rita Dove.
Welcome Grace Paley to Brockport.
The writing of Isaac Bashevis Singer. The poetry of Robert Hayden.
Our very special guest today, Lucille Clifton.
Nadine Gordimer. The poetry of Anne Sexton. Today, the poetry of Seamus Heaney.
I wonder if you'd like to read a section from the novel.
Welcome to the Brockport Writers Forum. I'm Jim Wharton, and I'm here with our guest, Justin Murphy, author of Your Children Are Very Greatly in Danger. Also with us today are two of my colleagues from the Brockport faculty, Michael Boston, professor of African American history, and Cody Miller, professor of English education. Cody, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so Justin, I first want to say, as a former high school English teacher, I love that you bring in James Baldwin in the title. You know, he is one of the patron saints of queer educators like myself, so I really appreciate that. And I thought a lot as I read your book, and also when I heard you just read your piece around this idea of lying and protection, and we need to stop doing that. And this was a book published a few years ago, and within the time since then, right, we've seen states enact book bans, states like my home state of Florida enact policies that make it a lot harder to teach this history. We have some executive orders that, depending on how they're interpreted and implemented, could also make teaching this history a lot more difficult. So I'm wondering, what parallels do you see between this moment that you're writing about and then our current political moment, specifically around questions of inclusion, race, and K-12 public schools?
Yeah, for sure. So it was interesting. One of the things I spend a lot of time on in the book is what happened during the 1 year in Rochester when they're trying to actually implement an ambitious integration program. And that's kind of the shorthand that it was used was integration, but actually it was a lot more involved in that. It was really a rethinking of what education looks like and a lot of kind of progressive education ideas. And the way that the pushback was framed was very much like the integration program is about openness and kind of understanding each other, intercultural communication. And the pushback was, no, we need to do it the good old way. We need to stop messing around with these sociology experiments and things like that. And so I think that really carries through to the present, that like whatever the specifics of a proposal or a theory are, there's kind of a difference between people saying like, let's try to open this up, let's try to understand ourselves and other people better, and other people saying, no, I don't want to, and to the extent that somebody is not connecting with my experience as a white, heterosexual, cisgender male, then they need to get with the program. And I think that we kind of, unfortunately, are seeing some of that today.
Certainly, yeah.
Okay, I in terms of reading your book, I like the way that you portray African Americans as well as the opposition with agency, self-help, doing for each side, doing for themselves, being progressive or aggressive. And the way you portray the integration story, you go back to the very beginnings up until close to the present. And one thing I found fascinating is how you portrayed Austin Stewart. You say that the integration started back with Austin Stewart, and you talked about or wrote about the struggles that he went through and the African American community went through. But when Frederick Douglass came on the scene in 1847, you show how things drastically changed. Can you speak to that and Douglass's influence versus previous times?
Yeah.
Was it embarrassment, him having the North Star paper, what have you?
Yeah.
What would you say about that?
I think, obviously Frederick Douglass is sort of sui generis, and there's a lot of things by then. The black community in Rochester has organized a little bit. The national climate around the proper place of African Americans in society has changed, obviously, as we're starting to approach the Civil War. But like the agency part was really important to me all throughout, and Austin Stewart is a really interesting case. So he's one of the he's really the earliest important black resident in Rochester, and he starts his school, and he mentions it in his memoir. In the way he talks about it, like, is a little bit conflicted. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, we started a school for the oppressed black children, and there was some initial excitement, but it shortly came to naught because the families weren't interested and didn't take advantage of it and weren't able to overcome the oppression and ill treatment of the white community. And so like that kind of has both things in it. Like on one hand, he's making this criticism that maybe makes us feel uncomfortable, makes me feel uncomfortable, like, well, the black parents don't care about their kids' education. But at the same time, he's wrapping it up into this larger thing of, part of the forces that are acting on them is like everything else in their lives. And it's not just a simple question of, do I want my kids to be educated or not? And so like from that point, from 1818 going up to the present, people are exercising agency, but they're also always doing it in like changing circumstances, whether that's Frederick Douglass in the 1840s and 50s, whether that's during the Civil Rights Movement, or even after that. Because, like one really important time that people are exercising agency is after 1972, when kind of the air gets let out of the balloon for integration and black families start saying, that's actually not what I want anymore. We want to have our own schools. We want to establish charter schools later on. And we're gonna like kind of give up on the idea of integration, and that's for, like soft-headed white people trying to make themselves feel better. And even though at the same time, polls show that black people even today are extremely interested in integration when it's possible, but they're not really exercising their agency in pursuit of that because they can say, rightfully, my grandma went to schools when they were trying to integrate them, and she got hit in the head with a brick. So I'm not gonna like put myself out there for that. So people exercise agency at different times and in different circumstances, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the strong voices in your book, making that the case that you just described, I think, is Lovely Warren, former mayor of Rochester. I think her voice comes through in her case for let's just make our Rochester schools better instead of trying to bring a bunch of white county kids in. You covered education for years at the DNC, and you were deep into it countywide. Was there a point where you decided, hey, I disagree with Lovely Warren on this? I mean, at what point did you decide all these, tell me if I'm representing this wrong, but all these sort of technical, standardized testing, tricks aren't going to fix the schools. We need desegregation.
Yeah, well, it came after having written about all of them and read about all of them, not only in Rochester but elsewhere. So if we take 1974, Milliken versus Bradley as kind of the end of the school desegregation era, that's been 50 years where essentially every single urban district in the entire country has continuously been cycling through all of the best ideas that they can think of about how to make this segregated, both racially and socioeconomically segregated district better or good, or as good as the ones surrounding it. And at any given time, there are some that are doing better than others, but the fact that there's not one of those single experiments, let's say thousands of these little experiments over half a century, that has stuck, and you can say, oh, look, they had a good idea and they solved it, that should give us pause. I remember, so one moment that really sort of stuck out to me that was right as I was starting to get deep into the book, there was one of these kind of periodic moments when everybody got together and they were going to make a statement that, like, we're not putting up with it anymore. So all the nonprofit educational leaders, Mayor Warren, who was in office at the time, state legislators, they all called a big press conference in the state education department, the regents, and they, the point of the press conference was to announce that they were serious about fixing RCSD, and the phrase that they kept using was, nothing is off the table. We're going to do whatever it takes. Nothing is off the table. We're going to solve this problem. And I asked a bunch of people at that press conference, what about anything involving the 19 school districts around Rochester? Like whether or not it doesn't, I'm not saying a full countywide school district, I'm saying anything that crosses city lines. And they all uniformly said, no, that's not what we're talking about. And so, like, that's off the table. It's not even just off the table, it's like hidden under the table and we're pretending it isn't down there. So that kind of like really solidified it in my mind that there's like a part of this spectrum of debate that we're no longer even acknowledging we could be having anymore.
Okay. That makes me think, to kind of thread a point here, I think I really like about this book is it takes a big view of what's happening federally, but it also kind of simultaneously zooms in this very local story. And you mentioned the Milliken decision, and I think a lot about parents involved, the case out of Seattle from, I believe, 2007, that, Chief Justice John Roberts said the best way to not discriminate on the basis of race is to not discriminate on the basis of race, and made it much more difficult for schools, for any kind of districts to voluntarily try to integrate, right? I think about the 2020 primary where then Senator Kamala Harris, comes after then former Vice President Joe Biden about being opposed to busing, right? And this was quite a moment on the stage. And then I believe it was 2 or 3 days later, the Harris campaign said, oh no, but we don't support busing, right? Like this kind of attack without a follow-up policy. So I bring all this up to kind of put us in contemporary timing, but to also hammer home your point. And my question would be, why do you think there's currently not an appetite at the national level for real desegregation efforts, right? We're seeing movements to ban curriculum, we're seeing all of these reactionary movements towards schools, but we're not really seeing a pro-integration, pro-schools are a public good argument at a national level. And I'm just curious, like, why do you think that is?
I think part of the reason, so the desegregation movement in the 50s and 60s and early 70s takes place especially in the North at a time. I mean, it takes place in the South because they have to, more or less. And it takes place in the North at a time when, because of the Great Migration, the black population is growing but is not yet dominant, like white flight hasn't fully happened yet. And so the black population of cities like Rochester finds itself in a position where it's important for them to attempt to integrate culturally, geographically into the existing power structure, because they're not yet large enough to exercise a huge amount of power on their own. So like they're a natural interest group for that. I think right now, and to sort of come back to Lovely Warren's point, there's no natural interest group for integration. I think that most white people living in the suburbs, some are in agreement with it in theory, but very few are in agreement with it in practice. And it's no longer the case that black people, by and large, are willing to spend like their own political capital on that, because black leadership in places like Rochester has invested in this idea of like, we're gonna improve our own things. And one thing I often say is like, you can't get elected to the Rochester School Board on a platform of, I can't really do anything about this, but if I can just convince Webster to get on board, then we'll be in business. That's an awful platform. That goes for the mayor, that goes for everything up and down. So if you're an elected official and the black and brown community is not really vocally asking for it, and the leadership is kind of invested in pursuing a different course, and you know that at least some portion of the suburban white constituency is going to come after you with pitchforks, then there's really nothing to be gained in that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I appreciate, in terms of how you discuss the migration movements. And one of the things I see in your book, you point out certain elements in the white community are willing to allow a few African Americans into white spaces. But as you point out, as more African Americans move into communities as a result of migration in the 40s, 50s, then you begin to get this resistance and exclusions. And that makes me think about ethnic groups. And my question is, from your research, did you find any particular ethnic group, white ethnic group, that was more resistant? And the reason why I ask you this, because I think about Buffalo, New York, and I've done urban studies in Buffalo, and one ethnic group that was very resistant allowing blacks to get in their space were the Irish. And it makes me think about Boston too. In terms of busing, there was a lot of resistance. So in your studies, did you find an ethnic group that was more resistant compared to the others? That's one question. And the other is concerning your interviews of migrants. What other stories came up from your research? Because I really appreciated that in your book when you highlighted the migration, the migrant workers, how they came up here and they developed communities and stayed.
So for certain, I think in Rochester it was Italians. I heard that over and over again, that Italians were kind of I saw it written somewhere, the stormtroopers of the anti-integration movement. And that's because like the category of whiteness, I think for us today is like really flattened, because all of like the white immigrants have been here for a long time. So like I'm Irish, but functionally in the United States, I'm just a white guy. That was not necessarily true in the 50s and 60s. There were many, many people who they or their parents had just gotten here from Ireland, not mostly Ireland, but Italy or Southern Europe or places like that. And so that's a dynamic that you see over and over again in American history, is that there are black people may share a lot of the hurdles and discrimination as poor white people living near them, but the power structure is able to put a wedge in that by saying to, for instance, the recently arrived Italian immigrants, yeah, you're poor now just like the black people are, but at least you're not black. And you may be poor, but like once your kids and your grandkids stop talking with an Italian accent, then like they'll have access to all the rest of this. And so I think like that dynamic, and also proximity in a lot of different places. Like the police was heavily Italian in Rochester. The vice kind of operation of gambling houses and places like that is heavily Italian. So there's a lot of friction points. The neighborhoods that are like the front lines of integration, like around Jefferson High School, that's heavily Italian. So I think that here, as elsewhere, like white ethnics, as they call it, that for sure. And then like those people will say, yeah, I'm like the jerk on the front page of the newspaper with the rock, but all the wealthier people who may agree with me, they just resisted by moving way out, like into the suburbs or into an outlying district. And so that's, you can argue about like who are the relative villains in the story. I'm sorry, remind me what the second part of the question was.
What other lessons from the interviews from the migrant workers? Any other stories you can convey? Because I found that fascinating. Because I love to study the migration movements from different cities. There's a commonality, like you said, relegating them to certain spaces, and as more and more come in and inferior education, low quality books, things of that sort.
Yeah. I was just talking last week, I was interviewing a couple they're probably in their 80s now, and they came up from Georgia with a huge family. And they were shedding light on an aspect that I hadn't really thought about, which is, so it's kind of like a bank shot. You come from Florida or Georgia, wherever, and you're a migrant worker in Wayne County, for instance, and then eventually you sort of filter over into the city of Rochester, is the way that it usually works. But I had never really thought about like the way that the community gets formed in intermediate stages. And these people, they were like, back in Georgia, they were kind of entertainers, musicians, and they ran a juke bar, and they kind of replicated some of that in the migrant camps. And so they were talking about how they came up from Georgia, and there was all these migrants that didn't really know each other, but then they opened up a juke, as they called it, in the migrant camp, and that kind of became a nexus for community, and people got to know each other in that way, and then that, in a certain way, facilitated movement into the city. I found that very interesting.
How do you find the people that you interview?
Once I know somebody, I'll ask them who else I ought to talk to, is usually the way that it goes.
Yeah.
From my connections as a journalist, I at least have people to start with. And then, of course, I'll go back through the newspaper archives and track people and see who's still around.
Yeah.
Sometimes surprising people to ask, I'm wondering about this newspaper article that you were in 6 years ago. Do you want to tell me about that?
Yeah.
I'll say, what in the world? Who are you?
I wonder, to what extent you, in the piece you read, and this is going to be a long question, and maybe too long a question to answer before our break that we're going to have in just a minute. But what I wanted to ask about is, in the piece that you read in the opening, you talked about stop lying. To what extent do you find there's a kind of lying where, say, I am engaging in an act of racist oppression and I don't want people to know about it. But there might be another kind of lying in which, say, I'm engaging in an act of oppression and I don't want to know about it. I don't want to admit it. So what I'm trying to ask is, to what extent has your project in this and other work been not just to educate, say, white communities about themselves?
Yeah, primarily, I think.
I mean, one example is the whole history, and we're going to take a break in just a minute. I want to ask you to talk about this when we get back. The whole history of redlining is something that it's a revelation to me in this work and other work you've done. Even though I live in a house that was not redlined but greenlined. But before you answer, we're here with Justin Murphy. We're going to take a break for a couple of minutes and hear from some students who are our crew, and we'll be back to talk more.
Are you interested in learning about the public relations field? My name is Keith Doherty, a junior at SUNY Brockport, and I would like to introduce you to the Public Relations Club. The PR Club offers an opportunity to be a part of an award-winning team and create campaigns for organizations, as well as offering networking opportunities for potential internships. Want to learn more? You can visit our club page at mybrockport.edu.
Are you a student athlete who feels like there isn't enough support from fellow Golden Eagles at home sporting events? Hi, I'm Isaiah Weathers, and here at SUNY Brockport we have the Eagles Supporting Eagles program. This is where athletes get together with their teammates and go to other Brockport team events to show support and a crazy amount of Brockport spirit. Here at the Port, we are a family, so let's support one another and watch each other soar.
Hey Golden Eagles, I know a lot of you out there love to golf, but don't know how to keep up with it while at school. If that's the case, I have just the solution for you, the SUNY Brockport Club Golf Team. It's a new club, so now is a better time than ever to join. Now you might be thinking, what if I've never played golf before? Well, club sports are usually much more welcoming to new players than varsity sports are. If you want to learn more, visit the SUNY Brockport Club Golf Instagram page or go online to Club Sports SUNY Brockport to see more information. I'm Nick Rivoli, and I produce this message.
Have you ever been scared to walk around on campus? Hi, I'm Amanda, a student at SUNY Brockport. I have a solution for you. The University Police Department is committed to your safety. We have a student-run patrol program that provides secure rides to those in need. We pride ourselves on crime prevention and providing a safe environment for students, faculty, and visitors. We also have other resources such as blue light phones and monitored safe exchange zones. Contact us at our non-emergent phone number or our campus escort line, keeping you in mind to prevent crime.
We're back with Justin Murphy, and I left you with a question about telling the story of redlining.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it the whole break. I think there's two parts to it. One is people legitimately don't know the history. Nobody of our generation learned in schools about the way that our communities were shaped in this kind of way. So I think you can't overestimate the value of just having kids know those things. But I do think that the other important part is that when something is so predominant, a thought paradigm for our entire lives for 50 years now, it's hard to look at it with fresh eyes and see how it's harmful, not only to those people over there who are getting the raw end of it, but to me, who grew up in one of these wealthy white suburbs where you get to and you won. And our whole society, our whole political system, to see the harms of it is very difficult. I think in the same way that it can be hard to think about the consequences of climate change when we're just trying to live our lives in the same way that we always have, in the same way that you see people before the Civil War, or even in the 1800s, having a hard time understanding why slavery is wrong, even though it's clearly wrong, but that's just, their grandparents did that, and their parents did that, and they did that, and that's just how it is. Mm-hmm. Not to equate all of those things, of course, but there is definitely a project in taking the time to internalize that and think, if this is how my community was shaped, I'm not responsible for that. I didn't do that, but yet here I am, and I am in turn shaping things for my children and their children. And so how can I decide on my own ground, what's right and what's wrong and what I should be pushing for?
Yeah, I want to say that before I read this book, I learned about this history from a lot of your reporting that was in the DNC, also from the film that you worked with Carvin Eisen on called Home Access Denied. Mm-hmm. And I'm also one of those people who, when I was a kid, I heard people say things like, I grew up in a segregated town. Well, people who are like each other just want to live together. Mm-hmm. And so reading this book, and it's sort of forces me to confront, to just throw away some comforting ideas that were false. And that, I think that winds up being you have 3 goals that you describe at the end of the book. And one of them is a program of anti-racism education for public schools in Rochester. How could you update us on that? You're working on that now.
That's going well, which is
Yeah.
good because the other 2 are dead in the water.
Okay.
But I work now, for the last year or so, I work for an organization called Our Local History, and that's what we do is we create educational materials about the local history of civil rights and resistance. All the schools in Rochester, in the Rochester area use our materials, and we're in a lot of other cities and communities across the state where we'll say, when you learn about enslavement, that's not just something that happened in Georgia, that is something that happened in Rochester. And not only to know those facts, but then to think about what does that mean for me as a citizen and an advocate in my own time. And so that's been very successful. I think that's been eye-opening for a lot of people. And again, it's easy to lose faith in this kind of incremental progress because it never looks like much on a given day. But just the very fact that none of us learned about redlining, for instance, when we were in school, and today I think I can say safely that almost every single kid in Monroe County learns about redlining in school. Not only through our efforts, but just because of improvements in the way that we learn about these things. That's meaningful, But that's tens of thousands of kids that aren't going to need to learn that when they're adult and then rewire their brain.
Mm-hmm.
I want to give a huge shout out to Our Local History. That's an organization that's done a lot of work with our education students and has really modeled and shown how we can teach these histories in classrooms. So huge shout out to your organization. They rule, they're great. Speaking of things that are taught in school, my guess is that for most people when they hear school segregation, their brain probably goes to Brown v. Board of Education, which by some measures is the court case that the majority of Americans approve of. Now, there's this kind of side argument that had it actually been implemented, would as many white Americans approve of it, right? But that is kind of part of the mythology of this country we tell ourselves, right? Brown happens in '54, eventually Obama's elected, right? That's kind of the march that we're on. And I like how this book, you really kind of ask us to pause and say, but there were cases after, and there was a reaction to Brown. Richard Nixon making, a litmus test for appointments, for instance, that you note. And I'm wondering, could you talk us through some of those decisions and the kind of current federal landscape and how different it is from Brown v. Board and the holding in Brown v. Board?
Yeah. So there's sort of 2, I would say, trends. And one is coming up to Milliken, which is in 1974, sort of a narrowing of, in 1954, if you ask anybody, certainly in the South, it's this is over. Schools are going to be integrated. And at first in the North, we don't really think that applies to us, but certainly by the early 60s, it's apparent that things are going to change around here. As you get into the early 70s, that narrows and narrows in terms of what you're obligated affirmatively to do, and districts are kind of finding escape hatches. And then Milliken, so that the case of Milliken is the city of Detroit is segregated. You can't really desegregate it because the white people have largely left, and so the court has to decide. On one hand, we have this affirmative obligation under Brown to desegregate, and on the other hand, we've got these boundaries that are otherwise inviolable, that you can't cross them for willy-nilly. And they decide between those 2 they're going to uphold the boundaries and not Brown. So that's one drift, is kind of narrowing what it means to desegregate. Since then, I think, and in particular in the case that you mentioned earlier, there has been a degradation just of it's been a long time, are we still talking about this? So if you have a segregated school system in 1970 and you get a court order and you put things into place and it doesn't really desegregate, well then probably in 1972 you might get in trouble, 1976 you might get in trouble, 1986 everyone's kind of getting tired, 2016, well, that's ancient history. Like this is, what are we talking about here for a 40-year-old court case, even if the facts on the ground have not actually changed that much. People essentially get tired of talking about it, and maybe another way to put it is like get tired from just the enormity of the problem. And so tools start getting taken away, districts start getting a free pass, so to speak, just out of exhaustion. And now we're in this trend where not discriminating means not saying the words black and white. Like we're gonna be colorblind, and that's that. And of course, that strips just about every tool in the box.
Yeah, and we've seen this with some recent Supreme Court cases,
That's
like
right,
the affirmative action.
Sure.
Today, as you noted, we're seeing a case about questions about the Voting Rights Act. So, yeah, thank you for that.
In terms of me reading your book, I like the way you define the setting and you put in as many actors as possible. People on the far right, people in the middle trying to make things happen, as Goldberg, you mentioned him. I'm thinking about, as I read your book, I was thinking about, you highlighted civil rights activists and some nationalists, but as I was reading, I got like a monolithic view in the sense that the African American community generally wants integration. But it also made me think about some opposition. I think about the Nation of Islam, and I know people that say the Nation of Islam had a very strong presence in Rochester, and that Malcolm X came, and you know that they were totally against integration. So in your story, I'm wondering, did you come across those types of people that said integration is foolhardy? Because whoever controls the educational system is going to control the story, and if the story is white supremacy, is going to instill inferiority complexes. So they totally were against that. So I'm wondering if you came across any of those individuals.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the timing of the Black Power movement is interesting because it's sort of at the tail end of the momentum for integration, and that's not entirely coincidental. But like in Rochester, the main Black Power organization is FIGHT, and when they're founded in 1965, the acronym stands for Freedom, Integration, God, Honor, Today. So they are at that time interested in integration. And in fact, the leader of FIGHT, Franklin Florence, his son is in one of these busing programs early on. After a couple years, as they start to sort of lose patience with the pace of the district and the response of the community to integration proposals, they changed the acronym in 1968, I think, from the I goes from integration to independence. And so there's definitely a moment, and for a lot of Black community organizations, ones that identify as Black Power or otherwise, you can see like very specifically and clearly when they sort of get off the wagon for integration. And what they almost always say is, it's not that we don't think integration is a good idea, it's that we've seen that it's not going to work. And so instead of banging our heads against the wall, we're going to dedicate our energy to our own institutions. And that is, as I was referring to earlier, that's a really big shift.
Okay. Well, what you're saying makes me think of that moment in the book when Malik Evans, who's not, at this time he's, I guess, on the school board, it says in response to the idea of a countywide district, it's never going to happen, which is different from, I want it to happen, but it won't. It's like,
and he does want it to happen. He is on record as supporting any integration measure that you can think of. But that's a political calculation for him, and he's probably not wrong, at least in the present, that it's not worth him dedicating his energy to.
When I first heard about the book, I assumed the title was a quotation from some rabid white segregationist, and was surprised and provoked to find out, as you read in the preface, no, that's a quotation from James Baldwin, and what he's talking about is not that Black kids need integration, not only that, but that white kids need integration.
It was intentionally provoking. I'm glad it had that effect.
But it's
a thing that I do think about was, and you get into the book, there is this kind of year where there is kind of some promise, some potential. Obviously, 1 year is a small amount of time in the timeline you're looking at, right? But I am wondering, like, what were some lessons, some moments of hope, something that maybe we can carry into 2025? I think in some ways in 2025 as a country, we are grappling even more with this question of how do we do pluralistic democracy, or at least I think folks with my disposition think, how do we do multicultural and pluralistic democracy? Folks, you know, in the opposition to me think we shouldn't. But what are some moments or some lessons learned from this year where there really was some strides made that can hopefully maybe point to something that could be in the future?
Yeah. One of the really interesting things, so the timeline is unfortunate. The school year starts in September, and there's an election that's essentially a referendum on the program in November. And when the school year begins, there's a lot of predictions that it's going to be terrible and people are going to be fighting, and they're not actually. The first couple days, things are fine, and there's some of the anti-integration folks are actually in the newspaper saying, like, well, this isn't good, everybody's happy.
Yeah.
And that ends up changing, and the lesson, probably as always, is that the kids are fine and the adults mess it up.
Yeah.
So these like terrible stories that you hear about throwing rocks at the buses and that sort of thing is almost exclusively instigated by either parents or not even parents, just people who live near the school, and that's their political priors, is that they don't want this to happen. One student at the time told me that she would be in class, she's black, and she would be in class with her white colleagues or classmates, and they'd be getting along, everything would be fine. And they would leave the building, and her classmates' parents would be there cursing her and stuff, and then their kids would kind of like change sides and get in on it. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the lesson is that when it happened, it worked, and but also a lot of the long-term benefits didn't have anywhere near enough time to come out. So, you know, that just given political incentives, that's a hard case to make. Like, you can say that about a lot of things. If we leave this in place for 8 years, then you'll see how great it is. That's not really the way election cycles work, though.
Yeah, yeah. And we have political science research, right, that shows new social programs, people are like, no, and then they have it, and they're like, well, actually, I kind of like it.
So.
Well, I give you a lot of credit. As I read through your book, you're a scholar that you highlighted a problem, which is great. And some scholars, they highlight the problem, but they don't give a solution. At the end of the book, you gave a solution. I may have it wrong. You tell me if I'm right or wrong. You mentioned public school system connecting the suburbs with the city and integration happening like that. So I'm interested. I think some people that hear that argument, they may say you're a utopian dreamer. And I'd like to hear what kind of arguments do you come up with to counter those people that say that about, perhaps may say to you about what you wrote as a solution.
Well, I would agree that it would be utopian to think that next year we'll have a countywide school district. Yeah. There's no grounds for that. One of the main stumbling blocks, not only to getting that, but to building momentum for that, is that there's even if you wanted to talk about integration or cooperation across district lines, there's no table at which that conversation happens. So even if the Brighton superintendent and the Rochester superintendent wanted nothing more than to merge their school districts or whatever, that's not how the funding flows, that's not how governance flows, so they can't really do that. So my first recommendation in the book is to create something like a regional education council or some level of governance where all the districts can communicate And that would not only be for the purpose, or not even primarily for the purpose of integrating or merging their organizations, but that could be if the suburban schools have a couple of Nepali-speaking refugee kids and they're not in a position to hire a full-time Nepali-speaking employee, then they can work with RCSD or with each other. That's often been the case for special ed. That's often been the case for vocational education. People don't realize that in the 50s and 60s, during the supposed heyday of Edison Tech, it was actually like half or more kids from the suburbs, because everybody knew that Edison had the best vocational program, so of course they wanted to go there. If you had a level of governance where we could talk about these programs and whether there is a possibility that money could flow through them, then that would allow you to take a lot of small steps toward what may or may not ultimately become a larger solution.
I want to ask you a writing question and journalism question, and little recap of your career as I've followed it. You were for years education reporter, daily reporter with the Democrat and Chronicle, writing this book, which I'm sure overlaps with your beat work there. But then, as Michael said, there's a program of action, which is sort of outside the bounds for a newspaper reporter. Late in your time at the DNC, the reporters went on strike, and the newsroom became, for some of us, the news for a while. And you were very outspoken publicly about the DNC. You got a contract, and then you left pretty soon after that and went on to working with Our Local History. Could you just talk some about this, how your work has changed, and how your career, how do you see it against the background of American journalism generally? It's a big question, but there's a lot to say there.
It was a painful experience for me to leave daily journalism. If I had had my druthers, I would not have done that. During the labor and strike process, we had a lot of specific complaints with our local management, and the contract that we got was a huge improvement and gave life-changing money to some of my colleagues who had been criminally underpaid for decades. I'm really proud of having helped with that. But we were never going to be able to negotiate Gannett into being a responsible media company. The incentives for them have changed. The business has changed. In Gannett's defense, which is a phrase I've never used in my entire life, they're not the only ones who are in that boat. Newspapers just don't work the way that they used to. So it's saddening for me, as I'm sure it is for a lot of people, that daily newspapers don't work, or any news source don't work the way they used to. I mean, every single, there's, I don't know, 70 pages of footnotes in the book, and every single one of those pages has like 10 newspaper clipping citations. It would be an impossible book to write without those, and that's true, I think, of almost any book of 20th century American history. Newspapers are just absolutely vital for that and so many other things. And so I have a ton of empathy for my colleagues that are still there and are still doing great work, but I don't have much more of an idea than anybody else about where it's all heading, except that I think it needs to be local, nonprofit, and seen as more of a community trust and not the money-making machine that it was in the middle of the 20th century.
Well, are you sort of describing Our Local History the organization that you're working with now, when you say that?
I wouldn't call that necessarily a news outlet, but the Rochester Beacon, for instance, has a nice model. I would say at this point, most cities in at least, well, maybe most cities in the country have some kind of non-profit thing of varying scales, but there's a big it's a pretty steep curve to get from a couple of disgruntled, laid-off journalists doing something out of their homes to a paper of record kind of thing like we had. It's not many have gotten there yet, but I hope that they do.
Yeah. We have a lot more to ask, but we're out of time. So there's some people. Thanks to you, Justin Murphy. Thank you, Michael Boston. Thank you, Cody Miller. I also want to thank the people on the other side of the cameras. Our director today was Mike Smith. Nicholas Rivoli is our technical director. Jonathan Frederick ran the audio. Neo Parrish ran the Chiron generator. Our camera operators were Keith Doherty, Jacob Patrick, and Nassim Hughes. Our floor manager and also professor today is Carvin Eisen. Thanks, Keith.